And we're back, Stripe Show podcast on a Friday. Hope you're having a good week. Special one here today, I promised, and we're going to deliver. Usually instructions on a Thursday, but it's busy, folks. Everybody is busy. I can tell you in the studio, lessons are good. PXG club fitting is good. We had an event in here last night. Team building, it's good. Everybody's thinking golf, loving golf. And of course, the PGA Tour is playing right up the road here, Hilton Head, Harbor Town, and another elevated event. One of the guys that's not there is Will Zalatoris. And of course, he is going to have some surgery on his back. And we've been talking a lot about his swing and the side bend. We talked about Joaquin Niemann and Sam Bennett at the Masters. I was getting a lot of feedback. I mean, a lot of DMs and emails and texts and phone calls and smoke signal. I mean, all these ways that we can communicate, right? So everyone's interested in what we're seeing with some of these patterns. So I reached out to a guy that knows a hell of a lot more than I do when it comes to movement and what that means to your body. He joins me. He's actually here in Florida. Mark Bull, how you doing?
Good morning, Travis. All good. How you doing?
I'm good. I appreciate your time today because I'm really looking for this. I'm really looking forward to this podcast. It's something that I've been talking a lot about. I had Dr. Greg Rose on a couple months ago before Will went down, and some of the things that they're trying to do with his swing to protect his back. You know, in an era, Mark, of speed, right? And it seems this flex lead wrist and rotate, face stabilization. We're seeing some swings that I think to the human eye look perhaps a little bit different to maybe the novice, right? They look at like a Will Zalatoris and they see this spine really hanging back to the right. They look at a Sam Bennett at the Masters and I can't even put my body in these positions, like in the way that he's like down here and looking, and they're like, my God, his back's going to break. There's no way he's going to see 30 years of age. When you kind of look at this as a whole, and we're going to break this down individually as we go, but when you look at this as a whole and what's happening in modern instruction, are there any concerns and red flags for you as a movement specialist in the game of golf?
Yeah, that's a hugely expansive question there, Travis. I think you and I could spend hours trying to pick through that stuff. And I think it's a kind of place to start. I think what's been lost a little bit in golf is some context, which is, I think, been hugely removed from a lot of these kind of discussions and maybe some kind of guidance that players and I've been exposed to. I think the thing with pain, if you look at pain as a very kind of day one approach, so this is kind of like the day one kind of entry-level approach. Pain is normally kind of a 5-year process we go through. So for me to get pain on a Friday morning, as is today, goes back to stuff I did 5 or 6, 10 years ago, perhaps, maybe, as a younger player. So even to kind of look at me as an example, I have a very historical bad right shoulder, which I'm still kind of trying to understand now as a 48-year-old. To what happened as a 15-year-old when I watched those Ledbetter videos back in the late 80s, is most of my generation back in England, and watching Nick Faldo, that kind of stuff. That's how I learned to play. So I'm still trying to understand my shoulder. And that goes back 35 years ago now for me. So when you look at pain as a very loose, very generic kind of day one approach to really what you experience today often goes back to what happened 5 years ago. So often why you now start seeing certain players that may now be exposed to pain, irritation, and in the real sad cases where they can't perform for a period of time, it's just that kind of 5-year cycle that they hit a shot on that Monday morning, that kind of hurt, and I wonder what happened, and what just happened then? But that was, in essence, when the body went, you know what, stop, that's enough, kind of no more. I'm kind of done moving that way. So I think it's a real kind of, it's a very complex area of pain, and even when you look at pain, and this is where it gets real fun, you can get the same movement, and this is where, say, even 3D has become very unhelpful, as in 3D motion capture, for example, as a pain predictor. But I'd add a caveat to this at the end, that looking at ranges that players move through are actually a very poor representation of possible and potential pain markers. And I'll kind of expand on that, then add a caveat to this at the end of it. But really what controls pain on a huge level, aside from someone's perception of pain and what's an irritation to one is nothing more than a whatever to someone else. They have what you call sensitivity, resilience, and tolerance. Some people, Travis, are just more tolerant, more resilient, and less sensitive to certain movements. That's on a very kind of neurological and anatomical observation. So their tissues, their joint architecture, their nervous system, for example, can tolerate certain movements more, are less sensitive to certain movements more, and are more resilient to certain movements. Then you get some players that will go through smaller ranges, almost, let's just say in a very fun way, half the range is an example of what other players go through and have been exposed to pain for example, a large percentage of their playing career. Why? Because they're not very resilient. Again, not on a spiritual, emotional understanding, more just their tissue types and their joint architectures. They're not very resilient, they're not very tolerant, and they're very sensitive to some movements. So that's where, when you have these kind of 3D ranges saying, well, if you're within these ranges, that's considered somewhat healthy. That is a very challenging approach today. Why? Because some guys can go through tremendous ranges and never experience pain. But then the caveat being, we know, you say, for example, guys that kind of move the wrist that way in transition. Not every player moves that way in view of the camera. Not every player moves that way in transition, experiences wrist pain. However, every player that I know has experienced wrist pain has moved that way in transition. Why? Because they are not very resilient, they're not very tolerant, and they're very sensitive to kind of move in that way. So I think before anyone can start to say encourage, if you look at golf, I mean, just say the last 10 years, we'll keep it fairly light today, every year has its thing. Every year golf has, this year's thing is X. Is it speed? Yeah. Is it launch monitors? Is it 3D? Is it club kinetics? What is it? Every year has its thing. And it may well be that's just kind of this year's thing because it's just where golf's at this year. And so I think when you look at, say, all these approaches, it doesn't matter what the approach is, initially, before you can understand the movement, you need to understand the human you're actually dealing with. What's their movement history? What's their coaching history? What's their training history? What's their belief systems, for example? So before you get into any kind of, golf movement approaches or movement philosophies, unless you understand the human anatomically, physiologically, conceptually, their joint architecture, their tissue behaviors, that kind of stuff, it's very hard to then really advise anyone, for example, on, say, a movement approach. So that's, I think, what's been lost in golf. We go straight to these approaches without really understanding the human in some ways they're actually kind of working and trying to help and deal with.
Let me bring up a swing here. And this is talking with Mark Bull. He's at Bull 3D Academy. And I got some swings here loaded in. I just want to start with this one. And this is Zalatoris. And this is a pattern in the golf swing. And for those watching on my YouTube, you can see Will on the screen. For those listening, I'll explain what's happening. And if you listen to the podcast, I've talked a lot about Will's swing. And Mark, this is a pattern that almost, I hate to say it, but I think like when we were younger, and we're about the same age, the golf swing was kind of taught like to bump your hip laterally towards the target, and side bend to the right for a right-handed player would almost increase fairly early, right? And you would feel like your hips were kind of moving lateral out from underneath you, and your spine would be, lack of a better term, hanging back a little bit to the right. And then, of course, you would rotate. And when you look at Will, when I look at this, is it this simple to say that, to me, his hips are moving lateral to the right with his spine taking on some early side bend to the right. And that's a pattern that would have that's a pattern, and you look at that right there through the strike, that's a pattern, generally speaking, can cause some back pain.
Yeah, I've never met Zalatoris, for accuracy. I've never had any experience of him, so I can't obviously speak with accuracy around what he does. But certainly looking at the video there, that I think also, again, the idea of context, Travis, that, you and I use very different equipment, different balls. We had to move differently back then to kind of make the equipment work.
Sure.
And so different now that players can move very differently because, in essence, in a very fun way, the kind of club does it for them. So you look at, say, movement, the quality of movement, how well we had to move. I say we, I never moved that great, but certainly, my the Faldos, the Sandy Lyles, the Greg Normans, the Sevis, the Woosums, that kind of generation, wonderful movers. They had to move well because of the equipment they were using. So then you come back to someone like the example you shared here in Zalatoris. I mean, I think and it really goes back to understanding what the spine likes, what the spine dislikes. What the spine dislikes, again, this then is always that, there's always that kind of lovely, the needle's always doing this. What makes Zalatoris such a wonderful player, possibly, perhaps, may also be at conflict with what his spine enjoys doing. And this is where it becomes such a wonderful challenge, to say, for his kind of coaching team there, that obviously, one of the best players in the world the last 3 or 4 years. I think he played Walker Cup in 2017, Zalatoris. So since he's turned pro since then, one of the best players on the planet, could have won 2 multiple major championships. So clearly a wonderfully established player. Possibly how he moves in his goals, and then maybe just a conflict with what his spine enjoys doing. So when we look at the spine anatomically, what the lumbar spine in particular doesn't really enjoy doing is having tremendous amounts of lateral flexion. So the idea of kind of side bend, as it would be more informally kind of known in golf. And also there's minimal rotation through that lumbar spine. At best, there's kind of 1 or 2 degrees of rotation available each kind of lumbar vertebrae. So really at best, you've got about 10 degrees of rotation in that kind of lumbar spine area. So when you've got these excessive amounts of lateral flexion or side bend, whilst that kind of lumbar spine is being taken through, or certainly encouraged to move through large amounts of rotation, anatomically, the lumbar spine just doesn't like that. That's very problematic. Very disruptive, and a real conflict to just how it's designed to move. So I think what you're now experiencing are these wonderful conflicts around things like, again, the equipment. We don't need to really move good anymore. Why? Because the club does it for us. The whole world's obsessed with speed these days without really appreciating how they move to produce speed. So I rarely meet anyone that says, "Mark, can you make me swing it slower?" Most guys these days, it's almost like it's kind of stamped on their kind of head as they walk in, give me clubhead speed, but they actually don't really understand why they need speed, or more importantly, Travis, the mechanisms behind speed, or really how they move to produce. But that's been lost, I think, in recent years. That actually, how do we need to move well to produce speed? It's just been about, can you swing it quicker? I mean, you've only got to look at, say, social media, the amount of guys that post, look at my club and ball speed. Yes, but look at how you move to produce that. It's the kind of missing part of that discussion. Mm-hmm. And you look at guys 6 months on, they're in a mess, they don't perform anymore, they haven't performed, they can't perform. In the very sad case of Zalatoris, and I really hope he gets back very soon, because he's such a great player to watch, Zalatoris. And these guys, unfortunately, can't move. And I'm not saying that's what Zalatoris does, but that's a very generic view of golf, that these guys have lost now. Actually, mm-hmm. What's more important is how they move to produce speed rather than just speed itself. And so I think what you've now got is this almost this wonderful collision of all these influences in recent years. The obsession with speed, and no one's dismissing that. Absolutely, I'm not dismissing. Speed is so important these days. We know that across every level. And I, for one, as someone that always is in trying to encourage people to gain speed, but done in a very sustainable, ethical way, which is very, very different, perhaps. Mm-hmm. The changes in equipment, the demands of the game, the length of the golf course, perceived perception, that everyone perceived distance to be the number one mark. And I was interested, I don't really look at social media too much. I actually looked at a real call clip from John Daly yesterday. So Daly obviously was the longest player in his generation. And it was interesting that how he perceives golf is still around, wedge play, short game and putting. Mm-hmm. He sees that as the most important part of being a very kind of advanced player on the PGA Tour now. The guys that pitch it and putt it. But you look at McIlroy last year as an example. Why did McIlroy have such a good season last year? His wedge play improved. And it was interesting, that very famous story with DeChambeau. I think it was at the Players in 2022, that how DeChambeau was a real disruptor to Rory, that Rory perceived he had to get longer to compete still, and it really disrupted him. Mm-hmm. He actually performed better again last year, and his wedge play got better again. So I think it's just all these influences have collided almost at the same time now. Equipment, perceived perception, the obsession with distance, don't really need to move well anymore now. Guys are now taking their bodies through ranges that anatomically they don't really have. There's been almost a dismissive approach to understanding how well you have to move to produce these speeds. And I think then you just get guys that, again, even coming into things like devices now which are used to encourage speed, they don't have a training history anatomically the capacity in place to actually then produce those forces, and more importantly, absorb these forces. Force absorption. We talk about force production in golf so frequently, and it's so important. Also, force absorption from the moment of impact to finish is, 0.2 of a second, whatever, depending on the player, 0.1 of a second in some cases. They're absorbing significant amounts of forces through the entire human system at such small amounts of time. So force absorption has been lost around some. So when you got these guys that are now using devices without having the training history and not having the actual capacity to absorb these forces, this is why you now start to see many players that move poorly. Why? Because the obsession is just move that device quickly without really understanding how to move that device.
Yeah.
And also having a history. In some ways, they haven't earned the right. They haven't got the right in some ways to start moving the devices fast without having the training history, the movement history, to actually then move these devices in a very ethical, very sustainable way.
Yeah, and you look at Will. So he had a microdiscectomy, which is a surgery to remove, part or all of the bulging or damaged herniated disc in the lower spine, right? Which you're talking about, right down in that lumbar area, where when you are falling back away from the target like this, and for those watching, you see the picture of Will, and I've posted this a couple times. That there's a lot of pressure being put there on that lumbar spine. So eventually he had to do something about it, which is unfortunate, right? Because this is a young man, and these are some things that are happening. The other thing that I think has encouraged some of this with the driver, and particularly, is our launch monitors and the attack angle, and understanding that we got to hit up on it a little bit more. So how do we hit up? Well, you're seeing it, right? Here's a picture of one of the ways that you can do that. So it's a really sensitive thing. And I think when you have players of the caliber of Will Zalatoris, of the age of Will Zalatoris, that's kind of why I think in many ways we're doing a podcast right now, because a lot of people are looking up to Will Zalatoris. A lot of people are encouraging more speed. And so you have to be careful, I think, in the way that you're doing that. And I think one of the pitfalls, and I feel very comfortable here, is this amount of side bend to the right. Your hips being that far lateral and pushed out towards the target, and you falling back away from the target with your upper body. And then you do that at high speeds, and you do that over and over again. Well, that's going to be a concern. Now, let's go to this one, because I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this one. Because I'll set the stage on what I see, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. When I look at Niemann, and I've had a couple conversations with some people on social media about this. Similar setup, right? A little side bend to the right, and then you look at Will, big turn to the top. But when you look at him come down, and you kind of stop right there. At first glance, you'd think, well, there's a lot of similarities there to what we saw with Will. But the reality is, I think when you look at Niemann, he's not falling as far back away from the target with the spine. His hips, at least in my eyes, are more underneath him. Like his hips haven't ran lateral as much as Will's did, right? Let's say the separation there of his hips and his spine is his hips are more underneath him. His left hip is like turned back inside his left heel, where his left hip was kind of more out over his left heel. So there's a little less of that. But with Niemann, it's almost like he's really, down towards the ball. Like the right shoulder is very low down towards the ball. The right elbow's bent at impact. He's almost like going down and trying to take a bite out of the ball with his mouth. It's that low. So yes, some similarities, but there really are some differences in this swing. Is that accurate?
Absolutely right. I mean, I think, again, to provide that kind of context in some ways there, Travis, so this is where I remember a very famous guy's actually a very good player on the PGA Tour, a discussion I had with a player in boys golf at home back in England some time ago. I moved in a kind of similar way to these guys, and I kind of spoke about, well, maybe you look at history as history leaves all the clues if you look close enough. It kind of leaves the answer, history, if you kind of look at it close enough. Maybe moving that perhaps the kind of best way of moving. And this guy goes, Mark, I really don't give a damn. I'm going to be playing golf for 5 years, make a ton of cash and go home. Okay. That was a tough discussion. He had no aspiration to play past 30. That fixed. He was going to play for 10 years, make a ton of money and go home. I don't care. I was like, okay, so that's the discussion you have with some of these guys. They don't really give a damn because they get paid so much money these days from day one. They don't need to do like Fowler, Niemann's, the Sevis, those guys that had to perform for 30 years because of where golf is at financially currently. And I think also some of the context behind this also comes back to some of the 3D systems we now use. That when you start looking, say, at systems that just measure the orientation, just the rotational values these players produce, what it doesn't acknowledge is what you say about Zalatoris, and also with Joaquin Niemann here is the position of those segments. So what the spine likes, the spine loves kind of being stacked on top of each other. So you look at it again, just anatomically, the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, and then equally so the pelvis, the thorax, and they like being stacked on top of each other. What they dislike is when you've almost got a segment, if I can use my fingers this way, you've almost got a segment going one way and then a segment going the other direction. So you get these internal pressure conflicts. You've got pressure kind of being shifted one way. You've got pressure being kind of moved and propagated through the body in another direction. So these internal pressure, these waves that propagate through our body, really create these tremendous shearings through the spine, these torsions through the spine. When you've got segments going one way, Zalatoris is probably a nicer example of that, how far, loosely speaking, how far back the head and the rib cage are relative to, say, how far forwards the pelvis are. So what you also have are these positional imbalances with these rotational compressions, these lateral bends, these torsions, which the spine just simply can't absorb. So you look at, the average spine can absorb about 2,000 pounds of pressure typically. So it can really impose a lot of force, the average spine. But it's done over high volume, high frequency, in different directions, conflicts to what it likes doing. So, for example, we look at someone like Joaquin Niemann here. Now, he may be that guy, Travis, you said at the start of our discussion today, that is just not that sensitive to this movement. It's very tolerant to that movement. It's also very resilient. He may have just chose his parents very well. I'll have kind of you and you, please. And you've made someone that can really tolerate this movement nicely. But when you look at history, historically, people that have moved the spine this way, this may not be him, and I hope for him it's not, have experienced problems because it just doesn't like that amount of lateral bend, that amount of torsion. And I think also it comes back to when we start having a discussion around, say, separation, around some of the kind of pelvis and thorax separation. Again, this goes back to a generation some time ago now, the idea of the X factor, which again, no one's dismissing the importance of the X factor.
Right. Mm-hmm.
True separation anatomically actually happens at the diaphragm. So if you can kind of look at me here, the diaphragm around about kind of here, about kind of, T6 to T8 on the spine. So when you look at, say, true separation, it's much more pelvis, lumbar spine, lower thorax relative to the upper thorax. How well can you separate above and below the diaphragm? So I've been exposed to this where people have actively tried to encourage these tremendous separations from the pelvis to the lumbar spine to the thorax, because that's how they perceive that separation to happen. You look at, say, the gait cycle or walking cycle, it really displays it so evidently well. When we walk, you can see the separation happen at the diaphragm. That's the true X factor. How well can you separate above and below the diaphragm, not the pelvis from the thorax? Why is that also, I think, had so much attention?
Interesting,
because a lot of these commercial 3D systems measure the pelvis against the thorax. The measure is the lumbar spine pelvis relative to the upper thorax. So you then got, again, some of these coaching concepts which we've all been exposed to, changes in equipment, measurement systems, beliefs, even ego gets in the way with some of these players. In the case of the guy that told me he doesn't want to play past the age of 30 because he's going to make a ton of money. And do you know what he did? But he's still playing past the age of 30. He's probably matured a bit since then. And then all these things around anatomy that some guys can tolerate these movements. And I hope for Niemann's case, he absolutely can. But unfortunately, most people can't. And that's when I think you're now starting to see this, that you get it a lot, say, with guys on mats. To give you another good example here, Travis, that, guys that get wrist pain and they go, oh, it's playing for mats. Rubbish. All the mat does, all the surface does, it either accelerates or decelerates the problem. Most PGA Tour players that have wrist pain never hit off mats. They hit off grass every day. So what the surface does, it either kind of delays the issue or accelerates the issue. And I think you'll start finding that some of these guys, and players that are, this generation, that are moving through these ranges, it will happen maybe at some point, may not be today. It may go back to what we said at the very start. Pain's a 5-year cycle. let's see where these guys, and that's always my approach to all these players that take these approaches you often see. Let's just see where we're at in 5 years' time.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And look at this here. You can see, from another view here. I mean, look at that right elbow down, that right wrist bent. I mean, like that elbow wrist. I mean, the wrist we know is bent, but the elbow, that bent, and then that amount of bending, right, as you're saying, kind of down towards the ball, not necessarily away from the ball with Will, but that bending, kind of crunching down in time. Let's see where that's going to be, that kind of contortion, if you will. And another guy that kind of captured everybody's mind was Sam Bennett. And I think I have, hold on here a second as this plays through. That's Niemann there. I think that, yeah. So Bennett does a similar thing, right? Yep. That is Bennett right there. I'm sorry. So I thought that was Niemann from target line. So there's Niemann from face on. This is Sam Bennett here. And you can see a similar, kind of move right there, right? Kind of down, contortioning. Look at that curve down towards the ball. Like I said, almost like trying to take a bite out of the ball versus with Will, it was, I'll bring Will back in here. With Will, it's bending kind of more away from the ball, right? Because his hips are more lateral. But either way, this kind of contortion and this kind of pressure is not ideal, let's just say, long-term for the average human being. However, there are exceptions, right? In the history of the parents and how the body can move, that there's potential that a player like a Sam Bennett, a player who like a Joaquin Niemann, might get away from it, right? Might get away with it versus someone who may not historically, depending upon their history, their parents, and their lack of movement.
I think you said such a good word there, Travis, exception. I always kind of say that they're exception for a reason because they're exceptional, which is why they became an exception.
Okay.
Exceptional people, which is why they are exceptions of what they do. And I think the other thing which has been not kind of badly described by some, that they're such good athletes these days. For most players, they're actually not as good athletes as, say, guys in the kind of Nicholas and the kind of Ben Hogan generation. You actually look at the idea of training. I mean, the idea of having to train is just ridiculous. We train because we don't move anymore. That's why we have to actually go and exercise these days, because what we just simply don't do. You look at that generation way back when they were powerful, good athletes. Why? Because that was life back in that generation. Because of the way life is currently, we have to go to a gym to exercise, which in itself kind of tells us a story because of what we don't do. So these guys may be explosive in some areas, but I think we'd have a very, very different generation, a different definition side of what I would define a good move and a good athlete would be, to say what maybe the commercial kind of gym view would be what a good athlete is these days. I think you've also got that these guys may look aesthetically like they're good athletes. You kind of see them training. I have a young lad at home. This guy he's 16, he's in one of the national programs at home, and he can cruise. I mean, this guy cruises with a 7-iron at 106 miles an hour. That's him just kind of flipping it. And he goes, I can go fast if you want. I said, it's okay, you're good. And he's the most beautiful move. He does nothing like the videos you've shared on here. But his dad's a farmer, and he works on the farm with his dad every day. That's an athlete to me. He literally does. He's a manual farmer, and he's a young lad, and he's actually starting to perform extremely well. That's an athlete, not a guy that has to go to a commercial gym because he hasn't moved in 15, 20 years, for example. So we have kind of different definitions of what kind of movers and athletes are. Mm-hmm. But also, I don't think you've got, as you say, with the introduction of launch monitors, which are brilliant. I have one, I use one. But again, we've got to look in the context again, that what the launch monitor doesn't tell us is what the player did to produce that value. It would tell us, okay, we've got to hit up on the ball, yes. But if you looked at why have they produced the value they're producing, it's been lost again. A lot of guys, we need to do X, yes, but you haven't told us why they need to do it. And there's many, many ways of producing an upward attack angle without having to do what some of the guys you've shown in these images today are having to do. So I think we've got to get back to that. It's understanding what has the player done to produce that value, and why they really. It's like saying, in a very fun, humorous way. It's like saying weight loss. Losing weight's not the issue. What we need to establish is why they first gain weight. So if you can start to look at the mechanism why they felt a need to gain weight, then you'll understand why they gain weight. Just saying to someone lose weight really doesn't tell us a great deal. And it's a bit like I just say with some of the launch monitor stuff. You've got to look at what they've done historically to produce that value, to then understand why they produce the value to produce, not saying you've got to help on the ball. Well, it doesn't really help that. So I think what you're then starting to find is guys are learning to move and are starting to adapt how they move and then start to develop these movements you've shown so well with these illustrations you shared today, because they haven't really established why. What's the real history, the context, the intellect? Now, that's what we've got to get back to. We've all, I think, golf's at a stage now of almost of intellectual failure. We've got to get back to some intellectual accuracy around how we move and develop these players, and rather than just say, well, the club's moving great because Launch Monitor says so. They're clearly doing a good job because their club speed's gone up. Let's just see where we're at in 5 years' time would be my approach. And I think what we may now be seeing, again, I don't know, we're now seeing more and more players that are now, again, at very young ages. They haven't got volume in their system yet. They haven't got the work in their system yet, which is why they're now being exposed to these issues you've kind of highlighted so well today at such a young age now. And I think we just got to get back to that intellectual accuracy. Everyone needs to breathe and slow down and actually look at what's happening.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting discussion, I think, in today's game. And unfortunately, I think Will's injury and now surgery, the microdiscectomy, has kind of pushed it even further forward as an example of a young man who has to work himself back now. And I think for all intents and purposes, he's going to have to change his swing. I mean, I think this side bend to the right, and then, now taking some of that out and trying to have less of that, that's going to be a tough go for him. So, but anyway,
sorry, Travis, to jump in. Sorry, apologies.
Go ahead.
I think the thing which is very important to understand here is that when you look at anatomically, looking just at the biomechanics of the spine ladder, when we go into, apologies, when we go into forward flexions, we bend into our start position. To produce rotation, the spine has to laterally bend. So for us to kind of produce rotation, put my hand in the camera. Mm-hmm. This is my spine, for example. For me to kind of rotate the spine in my start position, intrinsically the spine is actually moving through lateral flexion to produce what we see visually as a rotation. It's very much down to when you bend into flexion, the facet joint position changes, the muscular systems we use change. So the spine produces rotation very differently than what it would be, for example, in upright standing. So again, I think in my experience of being around players, and also, again, players that now, or some people that kind of looked at 3D data in particular, they see these lateral bend in the plots and, the spine has to laterally bend. The spine anatomically has to laterally bend to produce rotation. What's been lost also is it's about having those very balanced alignments. That what the spine dislikes anatomically is when there's a dominance in one direction. For example, there's more extension in the spine relative to lateral flexion and rotation, or vice versa. There's more lateral flexion in the spine relative to extension, rotation, and so on. And that's often where I think some of the use of 3D systems being unhelpful, that guys say, the spine laterally bends. Well, it has to because of the anatomy of the spine. But it's ensuring that there's equal amounts of lateral bend to the idea of flexion extension as it rotates, and then really make sure the forces the spine's been absorbed to are sustainable. They're being absorbed almost through the spine, not kind of across the spine. So that's another area which I think we got to kind of is maybe being kind of not so much lost, but maybe kind of not looked at in perhaps the detail as alongside really ensuring, in cases of Zalatoris, maybe as an example, that how well those segments stack, the pelvis, the thorax, and the head, not one going one way, one going the other way. Fortunately, for some can be problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think he's going to have to get him stacked up a little more.
Well, I just hope for him he gets back. I mean, he's such a wonderful player, and a guy very well played against him in the Walker Cup in 2017. Said he was a delight, great kid, outstanding player. I mean, he could have won multiple majors even last year. I mean, the PGA and also Masters. Clearly a great player. So I, for one, wish him nothing but success. And and I think golf needs people like him.
Absolutely. He's a wonderful guy, and just an exceptional player, ball striker, and so there's a journey back, and I know he's got some smart people on his team with Josh Gregory and Troy Denton, and then I think Dr. Greg Rose kind of helping him. So there'll be a journey back that will be well calculated, and I think it's fair to say getting the spine a little bit more stacked up. I know you're busy, man, but I really appreciate your time. This was fascinating stuff, and if you're up to it, later on, let's do it again.
It'll be an absolute pleasure. I think the final thing maybe is a place to finish on today. That often becomes a pain is until it goes wrong, often people refuse to accept it's an issue. Now, I'm not saying that's the case with Zalatoris anyway, but most people that I meet, until it actually becomes an issue, they refuse to acknowledge it is an issue. So sometimes it has to break for people to listen, which is a real sad place to be in life.
I think that's a very accurate statement. So, all right, Mark Bull, go check him out at Bull 3D Academy, Twitter and Instagram. Appreciate your time, man.
My pleasure. Have a good day. Thanks again, Travis.
You too.
Thank you.